My name is Taylor Shelton, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences here at Georgia State on the downtown campus. I'm a geographer by training, interested in the social and spatial dynamics of housing and urban inequality more broadly. Understanding housing requires multiple disciplines because it's such a multifaceted issue that lies at the core of so many other things about our society. Where one lives and under what conditions shapes so many other elements of everyday life, from one's health to educational opportunities to access to jobs and services to more intangible but equally important things like a person's sense of place and belonging within a larger community. As a geographer, I'm primarily interested in these questions of where that lie at the center of so many different social issues. But even in a field like geography, we draw heavily from the work of sociologists, historians, and others in our approaches to understanding housing and its place in our everyday lives and broader social structures.
My name is Fei Li. I'm an assistant professor at the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State. So housing is considered a wicked problem because of its complexity and the lack of a simple solution. We often mention housing issues like housing shortages, housing bubbles, lack of affordability, housing insecurity. These all involve processes and theories examined in various fields of study, including geography, sociology, economics, engineering, and urban studies. So studying these issues using the lens of only one discipline can only understand certain aspects of the problem, but not the whole picture. Another common feature of wicked problems is that addressing one aspect of the problem may cause unintended consequences or actually worsen other aspects of the problem. For example, simply increasing new constructions to provide more housing may not necessarily provide enough affordable housing. In fact, redevelopment projects that add more housing units to an area could lead to the loss of existing affordable housing in that area, increasing housing costs or gentrification and displacement. Another example is that housing policies intended to protect certain groups in the housing market, such as rent control that protect tenants, by itself could indirectly hurt the same people it's trying to protect by discouraging renting and discourage renter mobility, so it can limit the amount of rentals available to new tenants. So to create a comprehensive solution to housing problems required expertise and collaboration of multiple disciplines.
My name is Jason Flato, professor of philosophy at Perimeter College on the Clarkston campus. The city is a site of structural forces and macro trends, and we need to know how these trends affect people on the ground. These structures and agents both enable and contradict each other. The different parts of the city, for example, let's say property taxes, MARTA, gang leaders, small businesses, and the city council, all come together to create a very specific site of capitalist social relations. The city is a complex, variegated whole, and we need to zoom in and out of differing levels of analysis. The idea is when we ask, what does housing injustice look like? We want to know exactly what that means. And to figure that out, we need to interrogate those structural processes that produce and reproduce injustice. But we also need a more granular vantage point from all sorts of disciplines so we can ultimately chip away at the problem. Now, as a philosopher, I'm interested in grasping social reality. Part of that means showing what we think is natural is often not natural. Philosophy, then, reveals a glimpse of something more desirable and necessary than what already exists. In this sense, the philosopher is also working through and relating the innovations that come to it from non-philosophical fields. So the interdisciplinary nature of wicked problems braids all sorts of nodes that can work to offset suffering and misery.
Hi, I'm Daniel Pasciuti. I'm an assistant professor of sociology. Housing issues for sociology are both cause and consequence of a myriad of issues and related to questions around debates around economics, philosophy, healthcare, industry, and a variety of other disciplines. These have always been complex interdisciplinary questions. It goes back at least 150 years to debates over how to address questions, housing conditions, and shortages in Europe during the Industrial Revolution. There were very famous philosophical debates between Proudhon and Frederick Engels. At both a local and macro level, I see housing as something that is interminably connected to questions of governance and how issues are or not addressed in a cohesive approach. So this is rise of new forms of financial capitalism, explosions of municipal debt in the past decades has led to both changes in housing options, such as the elimination of public housing in the United States, and the rise of large-scale corporate landlords and management companies, which have altered the power balance between the state, local officials, landlords, and renters. Combined with questions of environmental sustainability, shifts in geographic centers of economic growth and political power, the need and ability to address questions of housing in an interdisciplinary manner is definitely increasing. This ranges from philosophical and potentially legal questions about housing as a human right and implications for seeing housing as something that is intrinsic to life, or seeing it as an economic commodity or an investment tool in urban growth and development. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN in 1948, includes the right to adequate housing. This was actually originally put forward by Franklin Roosevelt as the President of the United States in 1944. But by and large, we have retained our ideas of housing as commodity in this country, which is often direct contradiction to thinking of housing as something that is a human right.
I'm Jacob Hackett from the College of Education and Human Development here at Georgia State, Middle and Secondary Department, and specifically Curriculum and Instruction and Teacher Preparation. Why do we need multiple disciplines to address this wicked problem of housing? When asked about a problem related to housing, one may initially consider issues of inequitable access, gentrification, or perhaps sustainable building practices. And although these issues are important, the discipline of education gives us a unique way to examine housing. There's actually quite a strong relationship between schooling, school funding, real estate development, and a massive movement to privatize public education. So by looking at housing's impact on schools and schools' impact on housing, a tightly interconnected and complex story begins to emerge. For example, education research and policy has traditionally focused on something that almost everyone has heard of, the achievement gap, which is essentially the difference in standardized test scores between racial groups of children. Over the last 40 years, nearly every facet of education became fixated on closing these gaps. But the housing industry was also fixated on these gaps. Real estate companies began to use these test scores to create a highly contested but widely normalized grading system for schools. Quite a savvy marketing ploy. But we can thank education researchers such as Gloria Ladson-Billings for challenging our obsession with the achievement gap, which often led to children being blamed for their own low academic achievement. Dr. Ladson-Billings demands that we actually consider the education debt that poor students and students of color have been saddled with across generations. How schools have been suffocated through inequitable funding streams, such as property values, neoliberal reform efforts, and a hyper-standardized curricula. She demands that we use insights from sociology, history, ethnic studies, urban planning, and anthropology to be considered when preparing teachers, administrators, and policymakers. So these future leaders see the through line between redlining and school segregation to an equitable school funding and current patterns of gentrification that shape their school populations.